Most writers want to be read. Some want to be famous. A few want to be rich. Cormac McCarthy wanted the absolute. And to buy that, he paid with everything. 2 marriages, a home, his relationship with the public. He lived in a barn, bathed in a lake, and refused millions of dollars in speaking fees so he could afford to stare at a blank page without compromising a single comma. This isn't a success story. It's an autopsy of the price of perfection and creating your own authentic voice in the world. McCarthy did not pursue success. He pursued truth. And the truth always sends the bill. For nearly 40 years, McCarthy didn't just avoid the spotlight. He actively repelled it. In 1965, he published his first novel, The Orchard Keeper. The press called. He didn't answer. While his peers were chasing tenure tracks and book signings, McCarthy was chasing something else entirely. He viewed his life not as a career to be curated, but as a necessary sacrifice for the work. The comfort of the man was irrelevant. Only the durability of the page mattered. His second wife, Annie Delisle, recalled the phone ringing during their leanest years. Someone would offer him $2,000 to come speak at a university about his books. For context, they were living in total poverty. That money would have changed their month. But McCarthy would tell them that everything he had to say was there on the page. He would hang up the phone, and as Annie recalled, they would simply eat beans for another week. He wasn't trying to be mysterious. He just understood the transaction. If you want the work to be pure, you cannot sell the artist. But to understand how a man reaches that level of commitment, we have to go back to the first and most dangerous choice he ever made. In the modern world, art is usually treated as a contingency. You write the novel after you finish your shift at the university. You paint after the kids are asleep. You build a safety net, and then you see if you can fly. McCarthy refused the net. From the very beginning, he viewed the standard American life, steady employment, domestic routine, predictable income, not as a support system for his writing, but as a threat to it. He told an interviewer years later, "You're just here once. Life is brief, and to have to spend every day of it doing what somebody else wants you to do is not the way to live it." That sounds like a motivational poster until you look at what it actually cost him. In his early 30s, while working on his first novels, the financial pressure began to mount. He had a wife, he had responsibilities, he had zero money. The solution was obvious. He was intelligent, capable, and educated. He could have taken a teaching position. His first wife issued an ultimatum: get a job or the marriage is over. Most men would compromise. They would trade a few hours of their day for the woman they loved. McCarthy didn't. He chose the work. She packed her bags and left. This wasn't a case of a lazy man avoiding labor. It was a man frantically guarding his mind. He believed that to engage with the mundane world, to sell his time for a paycheck, was to dull the very instrument he needed to see the world clearly. He didn't want a career. He wanted to remove every distraction between himself and the page. And by removing those distractions, he removed his safety. He walked through a one-way door. And on the other side, there was no audience, no acclaim, and absolutely no money. There was only the poverty he had voluntarily chosen. It is easy to romanticize the quote-unquote starving artist phase when you know how the story ends. We look back at the struggle and see it as a necessary stepping stone on the path to greatness. But for McCarthy, poverty wasn't a phase. It was the ecosystem he lived in for nearly 20 years. After his first wife left, he didn't scramble to fix his finances. He doubled down. He moved into a converted dairy barn outside Knoxville, Tennessee. It wasn't rustic chic. It was a stone shell. He built the fireplace himself out of necessity, not craftsmanship. He cut his own hair. He washed his clothes in the laundromat and his body in the lake. For sustenance, he relied almost entirely on what he called institutional patronage. He didn't sell books, he lived on grants. A Guggenheim Fellowship here, a MacArthur Genius Grant there. When the MacArthur money arrived in 1981, a sum that most people would use to buy a house or fix their teeth, McCarthy didn't upgrade his lifestyle. He simply calculated how many years of solitude the money could buy him if he spent absolutely nothing on comfort. He stretched the cash until it was transparent. At one point, while living in New Orleans, he was evicted from a hotel room. The rent was $40 a month. He couldn't pay it. This level of destitute living destroys most writers. It breaks their spirit, or at least forces them to write faster, to write simpler, to write something that might actually sell. But McCarthy used the poverty as a shield. By owning nothing, he owed nothing. If he had a mortgage, he might have had to listen to an editor. If he had a car payment, he might have had to care about the market. Instead, he sat in that barn, unbothered by the literary trends of New York, and began to forge a style of writing that was as stripped down and unforgiving as the room he lived in. He removed the comfort from his life. Then, he removed it from the page. McCarthy didn't just strip the luxury out of his daily life. He stripped it out of the language itself. If you open a copy of The Road or Blood Meridian, the first thing you notice is the visual silence of the page. There are no quotation marks. There are almost no commas. There are absolutely no semicolons. McCarthy called them weird little marks that block the page, blotting out the rhythm of the sentence. He told Oprah in that rare interview, "I believe in periods, in capitals, in the occasional comma, and that's it." This wasn't a stylistic quirk. It was a moral position. McCarthy believed that punctuation was a crutch, a way for the author to hold the reader's hand and tell them exactly how to breathe, how to pause, and who was speaking. He refused to offer that help. Statistical analysis backs this up. A study comparing Blood Meridian to William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom found that McCarthy used roughly 50% fewer punctuation marks per word. He removed the guardrails. He forced the reader to pay absolute attention to the cadence of the words, or risk getting lost in the desert of his prose. He treated the reader exactly as he treated himself, with high expectations and zero coddling. He removed the signals that tell you, "This is a conversation," or "This is a description." In McCarthy's world, there is no separation between the dialogue of men and the violence of the landscape. It all flows together in one relentless, unstopped stream. He clarified the text by making it more dangerous. But if the style was difficult, the content was impossible. Because while he was stripping away the grammar, he was also stripping away the one thing American audiences crave most: hope. It wasn't just the lack of punctuation that alienated people. It was the lack of redemption. For decades, critics struggled to categorize McCarthy. They called him a macabre nihilist. They called his work unrelieved gloom. One critic attacked his worldview as juvenile, arguing that relentless darkness is just as unrealistic as relentless optimism. But they were missing the point. McCarthy wasn't writing horror. He was writing ecology. In the standard American story, and certainly in every Hollywood movie, suffering has a purpose. The hero suffers so they can learn, so they can grow, so they can win in the third act. Pain is the currency you pay for redemption. McCarthy rejected that exchange entirely. In his books, violence is not a plot device. It is a fundamental constant, like gravity. A rock does not hate you when it falls on your head. A wolf does not hate you when it eats you. And in McCarthy's West, the judge, or Chigurh, or the Glanton gang, do not hate their victims. They simply are. They are forces of nature, totally indifferent to your moral standing. This terrified the literary establishment, but it absolutely baffled Hollywood. Hollywood runs on a very specific engine, the moral arc. Bad guys must be punished. Good guys must be vindicated. Or, at the very least, their death must mean something. McCarthy offered a world where God had stepped out for a cigarette and never came back. He offered stories where the smartest, kindest, most capable character dies in a motel room off-page simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This worldview is toxic to a studio system built on test screenings and audience satisfaction scores. And yet, for some reason, Hollywood couldn't stay away. Filmmakers were drawn to his dialogue like moths to a bug zapper. They saw the cowboys, the guns, and the tension, and they thought, I can make a movie out of this. They didn't realize that by the time they pointed a camera at Cormac McCarthy, they had already missed the target. Hollywood looked at McCarthy's books and saw westerns. They saw horses, they saw shootouts, they saw brooding men in hats. They thought they were buying a new John Wayne movie. They didn't realize they were buying a funeral dirge for the American soul. The first major attempt to adapt him was All the Pretty Horses in 2000. Billy Bob Thornton directed it, Matt Damon starred in it. On paper, it was a guaranteed hit. Thornton tried to honor the slow, meditative pace of the book. He turned in a cut that was nearly 4 hours long. But Harvey Weinstein, the producer, didn't want a meditation. He wanted a romance. He took a pair of scissors to the film, cut nearly half the runtime, and replaced the original score with something more cinematic. The result was a disaster. It wasn't a McCarthy film anymore. It was a generic cowboy romance wearing McCarthy's skin. This highlighted the fundamental trap of adapting his work. Literature is internal. Cinema is external. In a book, McCarthy can spend 3 pages describing the way the light hits a rock, and through that description, you understand the character's loneliness. In a movie, that's just a shot of a rock. If you add a voiceover to explain the loneliness, it feels cheap. If you cut the shot, you lose the meaning. Most filmmakers choose option 3. They focus on the plot. They film the gunfights and the dialogue, but they leave the atmosphere behind. They try to translate McCarthy, but you cannot translate him. You either respect his restraints or you betray them. And nowhere is this clearer than with the one book that every director wants to make and no studio dares to touch. The great white whale of unfilmable cinema. Every few years, a rumor circulates in Hollywood. Ridley Scott is going to direct Blood Meridian, or Tommy Lee Jones, or James Franco. They all circle it, they all draft scripts, and they all fail. James Franco got the furthest. He shot 30 minutes of test footage. He showed it to producers. They looked at it, and they looked at the book, and they realized what they were holding. Blood Meridian is widely considered the greatest American novel of the last 50 years. It is also violently anti-cinematic. The problem isn't just the gore. Cinema can handle gore. The problem is the nature of the violence. In a movie, violence is usually kinetic. It's exciting. Even when it's horrifying, it engages the senses. In Blood Meridian, the violence is repetitive, meaningless, and endless. There's a scene early in the book, the Comanche attack, that describes the slaughter of a military company in such dense, Baroque detail that it feels less like a battle and more like a nightmare. If you film that scene realistically, you get an NC-17 rating. If you sanitize it, you insult the book. But the bigger problem is the structure of the story. A movie needs a protagonist. It needs someone to follow. Blood Meridian gives you the kid. He is illiterate, he barely speaks, he has almost no agency. And then there is the Judge Holden. He is not a movie villain. He isn't Darth Vader. He isn't the Joker. He is war incarnate. He is a 7-foot-tall albino genius who kills indiscriminately and fiddles while the world burns. On the page, he is terrifying because he exists in your imagination. On screen, he is just a big actor in bald cap. To adapt Blood Meridian to the screen, you would need to reduce it. You cannot film a nightmare without waking the dreamer up. And for decades, it seemed like McCarthy would never find a filmmaker who understood this. He needed someone who didn't want to fix the bleakness. He needed someone who was willing to let the bad guy win, and then cut to black. He needed the Coen brothers. In 2007, Joel and Ethan Coen proved that McCarthy wasn't unfilmable. He just required obedience. When the Coen brothers sat down to write the screenplay for No Country for Old Men, they didn't do what screenwriters usually do. They didn't outline. They didn't sticky note a 3-act structure. They didn't open up the narrative. One brother sat with the book held open, reading it aloud. The other brother sat at the typewriter and typed it. They treated the novel not as a suggestion, but as an instruction manual. The genius of their adaptation was not in what they added, but in what they refused to change. Any other studio director would have looked at the death of the protagonist, Llewellyn Moss, and panicked. In the book, Moss, the hero we have followed for 200 pages, is killed off-screen. We don't see the shootout. We don't see his final stand. We just arrive at a motel and find his body on the floor. It is an intentional, jarring anticlimax. It robs the reader of the hero's death they feel entitled to. The Coens kept it exactly as it was. They understood that showing the death would turn it into an action movie. Hiding it kept it a tragedy. But the boldest move was the ending. The film does not end with the bad guy getting caught. It doesn't end with a bang. It ends with Tommy Lee Jones sitting at a kitchen table, describing a dream. He sees his father riding past him into the night, carrying fire in a horn, embers to light a fire somewhere out ahead in the cold and the dark. And then, mid-sentence, cut to black. No music, no credits song, just silence. The audience in the theater gasped. Some people booed. They felt cheated. But the Coens knew something the other filmmakers didn't. You don't adapt McCarthy to make the audience feel good. You adapt him to make them feel the cold. No Country for Old Men won Best Picture because it submitted to McCarthy's worldview. 2 years later, Hollywood tried again with The Road, and this time, they blinked. The Road is arguably McCarthy's most famous novel. It won the Pulitzer Prize, it was an Oprah's Book Club selection, but as a piece of cinema, the filmmakers faced an impossible choice: be faithful or be watchable. They chose watchable. The film, directed by John Hillcoat, is excellent. Viggo Mortensen gives a haunting performance. The gray, ash-covered world looks exactly how McCarthy described it. But looking like the book is not the same as feeling like the book. In the novel, the horror is relentless. There is no respite. There is a scene in the book that defines the world these characters live in. The father and son stumble upon a camp recently abandoned by cannibals. They find a spit over a fire, and roasting on that spit is a headless human infant. It is an image of such absolute demonic depravity that it stains your mind. It signals that humanity hasn't just collapsed, it has been eaten. The movie cut this scene. It had to. If you put a roasting infant on a screen in a multiplex, you don't create atmosphere, you create a walkout. The medium of cinema requires a certain level of emotional safety. You have to keep the audience in their seats. So, the film softened the edges. It leaned into the love story between the father and son. It added a musical score that told you when to feel sad and when to feel hope. It translated McCarthy's interior despair into a survival drama. It was a necessary compromise. The film worked because it protected the audience from the full weight of McCarthy's vision. But what happens when you take away that protection? What happens when McCarthy writes the script himself and refuses to cut the baby on the spit? You don't get The Road. you get The Counselor, and you get one of the most hated films of the 21st century. In 2013, Hollywood finally gave McCarthy exactly what he wanted. They let him write the script. They hired Ridley Scott to direct. They cast Brad Pitt, Michael Fassbender, and Cameron Diaz. They gave it a blockbuster budget. On paper, The Counselor should have been a masterpiece. Instead, it was a crime scene. When the film hit theaters, audiences didn't just dislike it, they were actively hostile toward it. The film received a D cinema score. For context, cinema score measures audience satisfaction on opening night. A B is bad, a C is a disaster, a D is reserved for movies that feel like an insult. Critics were just as savage. They called it confusing, long-winded, and bleak. They complained that the characters didn't speak like real people. They spoke like philosophy professors delivering lectures on death while waiting for a drug deal. And they were right. The Counselor is not a movie about a drug deal. It is a movie about the mechanics of fate. In the film, there is a device called a bolito. It is a small, motorized wire loop that is placed around a victim's neck. Once activated, the motor retracts the wire. It cannot be stopped. It slowly, inevitably tightens until it decapitates the wearer. The bolito is the perfect metaphor for the script itself. In a normal Hollywood thriller, the hero makes a mistake, gets in trouble, and then spends the second act finding a way out. In McCarthy's script, the hero makes a mistake in the first 10 minutes, and then, for the next 2 hours, he simply watches the wire tighten. There is no escape plan. There is no clever twist. There is only the slow, mathematical arrival of the consequence. Audiences hated it because it violated the unwritten contract of cinema. We go to the movies to see people solve problems. McCarthy showed us a problem that could not be solved, only endured. He refused to give the audience the comfort of agency. He wrote a script that was structurally perfect and emotionally uninhabitable. The failure of The Counselor proved a final, bitter point. We say we want dark and gritty art. We say we want uncompromising stories. But we don't. We want the aesthetic of darkness, but we still want the safety of a story. When McCarthy gave us the real thing, Consequence Without Comfort, we asked for a refund. If we step back and look at the timeline, a pattern emerges. It is the central paradox of McCarthy's career in Hollywood. The adaptations that respected him divided the room. The adaptations that softened him lost their soul. No Country for Old Men respected the silence, and it is a masterpiece. But it also alienated half the audience who wanted a traditional shootout. The Road softened the horror to make it palatable, and it faded from cultural memory within a year. The Counselor was pure, undiluted McCarthy, and it was rejected like a virus. The lesson is harsh but simple. McCarthy's work does not want to be a movie. Movies are communal experiences. They are designed to be watched in a room with 200 other people, sharing emotions. McCarthy's books are solitary confinement. They are meant to be read alone, in silence, while confronting the void. But that hasn't stopped the industry from trying to steal his clothes. Today, McCarthy's fingerprints are everywhere. You see it in prestige TV. You see it in modern westerns. You see it in video games like The Last of Us or Red Dead Redemption. We have an entire genre now called grimdark, stories that are relentlessly bleak, violent, and morally gray. They copy the surface of McCarthy. They copy the desert landscapes. They copy the mumbled dialogue. They copy the sudden bursts of gore. But they almost never copy the discipline. They use violence as an aesthetic, a way to look adult or serious. For McCarthy, violence wasn't an aesthetic. It was a theology. When a character dies in a McCarthy novel, it isn't cool. It isn't stylized. It is just a sudden cessation of biology. The clones copy the darkness, but they forget the light that makes the darkness visible. They forget that McCarthy didn't write about evil because he liked it. He wrote about it because he refused to look away from it. He changed the landscape of American fiction, but he did it from a distance. And by the time the culture finally caught up to him, by the time the awards and the money finally arrived, he had already proven that he didn't need them. Cormac McCarthy passed away on June 13th, 2023. He was 89 years old. When we look back at the inventory of his life, it is tempting to call it a tragedy. The poverty, the failed marriages, the isolation, the decades of silence. But that is the wrong word. A tragedy is when something is taken from you against your will. McCarthy gave these things away. He viewed the comforts of modern life, stability, fame, acceptance, not as rewards, but as purchase prices. He traded them for the work. He believed that perfection is not a gift, it is a transaction, and the exchange rate is brutal. If you want to write a sentence that will last forever, you might have to live in a barn to do it. If you want to tell the absolute truth about the violence of the world, you might have to accept that the world will hate you for it. McCarthy's legacy is not just the books on the shelf. It is the terrifying standard he set for anyone who dares to call themselves an artist. He proved that it is possible to beat the house. But here's a question for you. We all say we want to be great. We all say we want to do something that matters. But if perfection demands everything, if it demands your comfort, your safety, and your silence, what would you be willing to give up?